The night had the stillness of a secret. Wind whispered through the cottonwoods, and the faint glow of a campfire painted the canyon walls in restless orange. The young farmer sat across from her, his hat shadowing half his face, his boots coated in trail dust. The Apache girl didn't speak for a long while. She had that look, half wild, half curious, as if she was still deciding whether the man before her was a friend or a danger. When she finally did speak, her voice was low, steady, and laced with mistrust. "I assumed we were going to be alone," she said. He glanced up, confused for a moment, before the sharp sound of boots on gravel answered her words. Soldiers were coming. He turned his head toward the ridge where the faint gleam of bayonets caught the firelight. The girl stiffened, her dark eyes flashing toward him. In that moment, everything, the fragile trust between them, the soft calm of the canyon, the unspoken promise of peace, hung in the balance. He hadn't called for them. At least, he thought he hadn't. Out here, near the borderlands where settlers and Apache paths crossed under an uneasy truce, nothing happened without consequence. That evening had begun differently. Before the soldiers appeared, the two of them had shared dried meat, coffee, and a silence that wasn't entirely cold. She had approached his small homestead hours earlier, leading a tired horse, her braids tangled from the wind. He had known better than to reach for his rifle when he saw her. She wore no war paint, carried no weapon in hand, only a cautious dignity that demanded respect. She'd come asking for shelter, she said, from a sandstorm that had swallowed the southern trails. Her words were careful, her English accented but clear, learned from traders or missionaries. He'd given her water, a blanket, and space near the fire. For a while they said little. He'd watched the firelight dance across her copper-toned skin, noticing the quiet strength in her movements. She wasn't like any woman he'd known in the nearby towns. Everything about her was different. The way she sat alert even while resting. The way her eyes searched the horizon as though expecting something. There was something proud and untamed about her. Something that spoke of generations who had lived by the bow, the hunt, and the wind. He had wanted to ask why she was alone, but the way she held herself stopped him. Some questions, he'd learned, were best left to the silence of the plains. The sun had long set, and the moon rose pale and uncertain. Coyotes called in the distance. He was about to pour her another cup of coffee when she leaned forward slightly as if she'd caught a sound. That's when she said it. Her voice had dropped to a whisper. "I assumed we were going to be alone." The soldiers arrived soon after. 4 of them on horseback, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the flickering light. Dust trailed behind as they dismounted, rifles slung over their shoulders. Their leader, a man with a scar across his cheek, strode forward like someone who owned the night. The farmer stood up uneasy. The Apache girl didn't move. She watched them like a hawk watches wolves near her den, silent, tense, ready. "What's this?" the soldier asked, eyeing her as though she were contraband. "Didn't know you had company out here, friend." "She came before sundown," the farmer said carefully. "Storm drove her off the ridge. She asked for water, that's all." The soldier's grin was cold. "You offering charity to the enemy now?" The farmer's jaw tightened. "She's no enemy tonight." The words hung in the air heavier than gunpowder. In the silence that followed, the Apache girl stood slowly, her posture straight, chin lifted. She met the soldier's gaze without fear. "Your fight is not with me," she said, her tone calm but edged with something fierce. "I only needed a place to wait out the wind." The soldier chuckled, but his eyes didn't soften. "You people always have a reason, don't you?" He turned to the farmer. "You know harboring her could cost you your land. Orders came last week. No Apaches allowed near settler property without escort." The farmer's heart pounded. He hadn't heard any new orders. News from the fort traveled slow this far out. He looked at the girl, then back at the men. "She's not staying," he said. "She just needed rest." "You'll move on, won't you?" But the soldiers didn't move. One of them circled the camp, kicking dirt over the fire. Another stared at the girl's face with open hostility. The tension thickened until even the night air seemed to hold its breath. The Apache girl turned slightly toward the farmer. "You said this land was free," she murmured. "Free for anyone who meant no harm." "It should be," he answered under his breath. "But it isn't anymore." Something in her eyes flickered, something between sadness and defiance. She looked past him toward the shadowy ridge beyond the soldiers. "Then freedom is only a word," she said softly. The lead soldier stepped closer, lowering his rifle but keeping his hand near the trigger. "She's coming with us," he declared. Can't have her wandering around. Orders are orders." Before the farmer could respond, the girl stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "I am not a prisoner," she said quietly. "And I will not go." The air cracked with the sound of a cocked gun. The farmer moved instinctively, placing himself between her and the soldier. "Put it down," he said. "You're not taking her." The soldier's tone hardened. "You want to die protecting her, boy?" "Not protecting," he said. "Doing what's right." The Apache girl's eyes widened, not in fear but in something closer to disbelief. She had not expected a white man to stand for her, not out here, where the lines between mercy and cruelty blurred under the desert sun. For a long moment, no one moved. The campfire's last embers pulsed faintly, throwing long shadows that stretched like ghosts. The soldiers shifted uneasily, sensing something about to break. Then a faint rustle came from the darkness beyond the ridge. Horses, many of them. The sound made the soldiers stiffen. The Apache girl turned her head slightly, listening. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she didn't. "More of your kind?" the scarred soldier asked, lifting his rifle higher. She didn't answer. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. The wind carried a whisper that only she seemed to understand. It wasn't the sound of danger. It was a signal. The farmer realized it too late. Whatever was coming from the ridge wasn't just the night wind. He looked at her, and in her eyes he saw both fear and certainty. "You should have let me go before they arrived," she said quietly. "Now none of us will leave untouched." The soldiers began shouting orders, their voices echoing through the canyon. Horses reared, hooves striking rock. The farmer reached for his rifle, his pulse hammering in his ears. The Apache girl didn't move. She stood as still as the mountains around her, her face calm in the chaos. And then, under the silver glow of the rising moon, the first war cry split the night. He turned to her, wanting to ask who they were. What she had known all along, but before he could speak, she met his gaze one last time. "I assumed we were going to be alone," she said again, almost whispering, her voice trembling not with fear but with fate. The next instant, the sound of thunder filled the canyon, not from the sky but from rifles. The fire was snuffed out by the wind, and the night swallowed everything whole. Smoke curled through the canyon as the first bullets echoed against the stone walls. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the night that had once felt still was now alive with chaos. The young farmer dropped to the ground, clutching his rifle but uncertain which way to point it. The Apache girl had vanished from his side in the confusion, her shadow swallowed by the dark. He heard the sharp whistle of arrows slicing the air, and the heavy crack of rifles firing in reply. Dust rose thick enough to choke on, and through it he could make out shapes, riders sweeping down from the ridge, their cries fierce and haunting. He crawled behind a fallen log, heart pounding. All he could think was that this was not supposed to happen. She had come for shelter, not to start a war. But out here, even a single step across an invisible line could spark one. The soldiers returned fire, shouting to each other, their fear hidden behind orders. The Apache warriors were ghosts in the night, there one moment, gone the next, their voices echoing like the wind through hollow stone. When the gunfire eased for a brief moment, he risked a look. The leader of the soldiers lay bleeding near the fire pit, his scarred face pale under the moonlight. One of his men was trying to drag him toward a horse, shouting for help that wasn't coming. Then he saw her again, the Apache girl, standing near the ridge, bow in hand, her dark hair loose and wild. She wasn't firing, not running either. She was watching everything burn. He wanted to shout to her, but something stopped him. She looked different now, no longer the cautious guest who'd shared his fire, but something older, stronger, as if the land itself had called her name and she had answered. By dawn, the gunfire had stopped. Smoke rose in thin gray columns, carrying with it the bitter smell of blood and gunpowder. The soldiers who survived fled east, leaving behind the wounded and the dead. The farmer sat against a rock, exhausted, his rifle resting across his knees. The Apache girl walked toward him slowly, her steps silent on the dirt. Her expression was calm, but her eyes told a different story. Grief, pride, and something unspoken. "You didn't tell me they were coming," he said quietly. "I didn't know," she replied. Her voice was low but steady. "But they must have followed me," he frowned. "Your people?" She hesitated, then nodded. "They thought the soldiers took me. They came for me." He stared at her for a moment, the truth settling heavy between them. "And now they'll think I was part of it," he said. Her gaze softened. "You helped me. They'll see that." I'm not sure they will, he murmured. No one out here looks close enough to tell who's right and who's just trying to stay alive. She didn't argue. Instead, she turned her face toward the rising sun. The sky was streaked with red and gold, like the world had been reborn out of fire. This land remembers everything, she said. Every promise, every lie, every drop of blood. It doesn't forget. They buried the dead in silence, soldiers and warriors alike. The farmer didn't know their names, but he felt it was right to give them rest. The Apache girl placed small stones over each mound, murmuring words he didn't understand but somehow felt. When it was done, he looked around the broken camp. His wagon was scorched, his supplies scattered. The small patch of earth he'd worked for 2 years was now a battlefield. They'll come back, he said. The army won't let this go. I know, she answered. And they'll blame you, he nodded slowly. Then I've got nowhere left to go, she studied him quietly. There's a place north of here, she said after a moment. Hidden valley beyond the red cliffs. My people don't go there anymore, but it's safe. You can rest there until it's clear. He hesitated. Why help me? You owe me nothing. Her eyes met his. You gave me water when you didn't have to. That is not forgotten. They left before noon, moving through the canyons where the sun cast long shadows. The land stretched endlessly, harsh yet beautiful. Dry riverbeds, sagebrush plains, and red stone spires that rose like monuments to forgotten times. He followed her lead, trusting her instincts even when the path seemed uncertain. She moved like someone who belonged to the wilderness, every step sure and deliberate. As they rode, she began to tell him pieces of her story, not everything, but enough for him to understand. Her tribe had once lived freely across the southern hills, but after the raids and treaties, most were forced onto reservations. She had stayed behind with a few families who refused to bow. When soldiers burned their camp 2 weeks ago, she ran, carrying what little she could. They say we are wild, she said, her voice steady against the wind. But the wild never lies. It only defends itself. He listened without interrupting. Her words carried the weight of something older than either of them, a struggle born from land, pride, and survival. When she finished, the silence between them felt deeper but not empty. That night they camped near a creek. The water was cold, clear, and full of stars. She gathered dry wood and he started a small fire. They sat across from each other again, just like that first night, only now the quiet was different. It wasn't mistrust anymore. It was understanding. You never told me your name, he said. She looked at him for a moment, then said softly, Tayana. He repeated it, careful not to misplace the sound. Tayana, he said again. It means something? It means dawn, she replied. My mother said I was born when the sky turned red. He smiled faintly. Seems fitting. And you? She asked. He hesitated, then gave his name, though it felt almost out of place here, small and ordinary beside hers. Tayana studied him for a long moment. You came west alone? He nodded. After the war, there wasn't much left back east, just smoke and memories. I came looking for land that didn't belong to anyone yet. Her brow furrowed. There is no land that belongs to no one. Every hill, every stone, it remembers who walked it before. He thought about that in silence. She was right. The world wasn't empty just because men declared it so. Later that night, when the fire had burned low, she looked toward the stars and said quietly, They'll keep hunting, not just for me, for anyone they think helps us. He stirred the coals, watching sparks drift upward. Then we stay ahead of them, he said. You can't run forever, she warned. He met her eyes. Maybe not, but for now it's all I can do. In the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing through the valley. Tayana lifted her chin slightly, listening. They hunt in silence until the last moment, she said. The soldiers are not so patient. The next days blurred into one long ride north. They avoided trails, crossed dry riverbeds, and slept under open skies. Sometimes she spoke, sometimes she didn't. He learned to read her silences. They weren't empty, but full of thought. When she stopped to touch the bark of a juniper or whisper toward the horizon, he didn't ask why. He began to feel that she was speaking to the land itself, to ancestors who still walked unseen. One afternoon, they came across an abandoned mission. Its walls were half collapsed, the bell tower broken. Vines crept up the old stone and birds nested in the rafters. Tayana paused there, her expression unreadable. My mother was taken to one like this, she said quietly. They said they'd make her civilized. She never came back, He lowered his hat, unsure what to say. "I'm sorry," he offered. She gave a faint nod. "Sorry doesn't bring the dead back." Then she turned and walked on. As the days passed, the bond between them grew, uneasy but undeniable. He began to understand her in ways that didn't need words. She in turn started to trust his presence, though she never fully relaxed. There was always that watchful spark in her eyes, as if she expected the world to turn on her at any moment. When they finally reached the red cliffs, the valley below opened like a secret. The air was cooler, the grass greener. A stream wound through the center, glinting like silver in the sunlight. It was the kind of place that could almost make a man believe in peace. "This is it?" he asked. Tayana nodded. "No one comes here. The old stories say it's sacred ground. The soldiers fear curses, so they keep away." He looked around, the wind brushing through the tall grass. "Then maybe it's the only safe place left." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on the horizon where the sun dipped low, turning the sky blood red. "Safe doesn't last," she said finally. Not for long. He wanted to believe she was wrong. But deep down he knew she wasn't. The land had a way of remembering, and it always came collecting what was owed. That night, as they settled by the stream, Tayana spoke again, her tone distant. "You'll have to choose soon," she said. "When they come again, and they will, you'll have to decide who you are." He looked at her, unsure what she meant. "And you?" Her dark eyes met his, reflecting the firelight. "I already chose." The sound of a distant echo broke the stillness, hooves faint but unmistakable. He froze, listening. Tayana's hand moved to the knife at her belt. The night seemed to tighten around them once more, the peace they'd found slipping away like smoke. Neither spoke. The only sound was the slow approach of riders and the whisper of the wind over the red cliffs. The past was coming for them, and it was closer than either had dared to admit. The riders came just after midnight. The first thing the farmer heard was the low rumble of hooves rolling through the valley, followed by the jingle of metal and the distant crack of a rifle. Tayana rose from her blanket without a word, her body tense and alert. The fire was down to glowing embers and the air smelled of rain and danger. He reached for his rifle, his hand shaking slightly. They had been careful for days, staying off main trails, avoiding smoke by day, and traveling by moonlight. Yet somehow someone had found them. Through the darkness, faint lanterns glimmered like fireflies. At least 6 riders, maybe more. He could make out their outlines moving slow, cautious, trained. Soldiers. They were sweeping the canyon in a wide circle, methodical and quiet. Tayana crouched near him, whispering, "They track by horses. We must move on foot." He nodded, and they led their mounts deeper into the shadows, releasing them near the rocks. The horses snorted softly, uneasy, as if they too sensed the hunt closing in. The two of them slipped between the red boulders, following a narrow trail that led upward. Each step was careful, every sound swallowed by the wind. Below them, voices carried, men calling to one another, spreading out, rifles ready. Tayana led the way, her movements graceful, almost soundless. He followed, his breath heavy in the cold air. The climb was steep and stones slid under his boots. When he stumbled, she caught his arm and steadied him, her hand strong despite her small frame. "Quiet," she whispered. "They are close." He could hear them now. One voice clearer than the rest, sharp and commanding. "Spread out! She's not alone. The man who helped hers wanted too. Bring them in alive if you can." That voice chilled him. It belonged to the same scar-faced officer he thought had died at the camp. Somehow the man had survived and brought reinforcements. They weren't just chasing an Apache fugitive anymore. They were chasing both of them. By dawn, the riders were still combing the lower valley. Tayana and the farmer reached a narrow ridge that overlooked the plains beyond. The horizon stretched endless and golden, but it felt like a trap. She looked back toward the canyon. "They will follow until they find us," she said. "They do not stop." He sank onto a rock, weary. "Then what do we do?" She studied the land, thinking. "We go north to the trading post near San Miguel. There are settlers there who deal with both sides. Maybe we can trade for new horses, disappear." He hesitated. "And if they're waiting there too?" Her eyes met his. "Then we keep running. Or we make them stop." They rode for hours that day, cutting through dry creek beds and over windswept ridges. The sun was relentless, and every sound seemed to echo too loud. Around midday, they spotted smoke on the horizon. Tayana signaled for him to dismount and crouched low. "That's not their fire," she said quietly. "Too small. Maybe hunters, maybe traders. They approached carefully until the smell of roasting meat reached them. 3 men sat by a wagon near a dead cottonwood, rough-looking but not soldiers. One wore a tattered hat and a revolver slung low. Another had the sharp eyes of a man who'd lived too long on the edge of law. The third, younger, spotted them first and jumped up. "Hold it there!" he shouted, reaching for his gun. Tayana stepped forward before the farmer could speak. "We mean no harm," she said evenly. "We need water." The men exchanged looks. The older one spat into the dirt. "You picked the wrong company to beg from, Apache." The farmer's jaw tightened. "We'll pay," he said. "We just need water for the road ahead." The man's eyes narrowed. "You one of them sympathizers the army's hunting?" The question hung like smoke. The farmer didn't answer, but that was enough. The younger man lifted his rifle. Tayana's hand went to her knife and the air between them thickened. Then the older man laughed suddenly. "Relax, boy. We ain't no soldiers. Water's in the barrel behind the wagon. Just don't think about stealing the horse and we got no problem." The tension eased, but only a little. As they filled their canteens, the farmer noticed something strange. The wagon bore fresh bullet holes. "You have trouble recently?" he asked. The man smirked. "Out here, trouble's the only thing that visits regular." He looked at Tayana, his tone shifting. "You'd best hide that face of yours, girl. Word is the army's paying gold for any Apache caught alive." Tayana met his gaze without flinching. "Then it is a good thing I am not caught." The man's grin faded. Something in her voice made him uneasy. When they rode off again, the farmer couldn't shake the feeling that those men might tell someone about seeing them. Tayana said nothing, but her eyes stayed fixed on the trail ahead, unreadable. By evening, storm clouds gathered. The wind turned sharp, carrying grit that stung their faces. They found shelter in a shallow cave near the edge of a bluff. Rain came hard and sudden, turning the desert into a roaring sea of mud. Inside, they built a small fire and dried their clothes in silence. After a while, he spoke. "Back there, you didn't seem afraid." She poked the fire with a stick. "Fear wastes breath," she said simply. "My father used to say that." "What happened to him?" he asked. She paused. "The soldiers took him. He never came back." He said nothing, but the look in her eyes told him the story didn't need words. When the storm passed, they set out again, the world fresh and washed clean. But peace never lasted. Near sundown, as they crossed a narrow pass, a gunshot cracked from behind them. A bullet tore through his sleeve, grazing his arm. He spun his horse around, spotting figures on the ridge, 2 of the bounty hunters from the camp they'd passed. "Go!" he shouted. Tayana didn't hesitate. They spurred their horses into a gallop, racing down the rocky slope. Bullets ricocheted off stone, sparks flying. The trail twisted sharply, forcing them to duck low under overhangs. When they reached the flat plain below, she turned her horse and fired back with the soldier's revolver she'd taken days ago. The sound echoed through the valley. One of the riders fell, the other turned back. The silence that followed was deafening. The farmer pulled his bleeding arm tight to his chest. "We can't keep running like this," he said. "They'll send more." Tayana dismounted and looked toward the ridge. "Then we stop running," she said quietly. "We fight on our ground," he frowned. "What ground?" "The valley where we first met," she said. "They think it's cursed, but I know a way through the cliffs. We can make a stand there." He stared at her, torn between disbelief and exhaustion. "You mean to fight soldiers?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I mean to end the chase." The plan sounded impossible, but something in her conviction steadied him. Maybe she knew the land well enough to make it work. Maybe it was madness. But at that point, he had no choice but to trust her. They turned south again, retracing the trail of fire and blood that had first bound their fates. Along the way, they came upon a small cabin near an abandoned mine. It looked empty, but the farmer checked it anyway. Inside, he found an old journal, half-burned, filled with sketches of the land and notations in faded ink, Apache words mixed with English. Tayana studied the pages under the dim light. "This was written by a soldier," she said, "one who tried to understand us." The discovery seemed to stir something in her, a reminder that not all who wore uniforms were heartless. "Maybe," she said softly, "there were some who wanted peace." He nodded. "Maybe there still are. They stayed there for the night." She bandaged his wound with cloth torn from her shawl. As she worked, her hands were gentle, but her face remained distant. He wanted to tell her how much he admired her strength, how he'd begun to see the world differently since meeting her, but he couldn't find the right words. Instead, he asked, "If we survive this, what will you do?" She didn't look up. Go where my people still remember the old songs. Where the soldiers do not come. And me? He asked quietly. Her hands paused. You will go where you belong. He wanted to say that maybe he'd already found that place with her, but the moment passed. At dawn, they left the cabin behind. Smoke rose faintly in the distance once more, the soldiers closing in. The chase wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The land stretched before them like a test of will, each mile drawing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. And as they rode, the farmer couldn't shake the haunting feeling that somewhere in all this chaos, fate was watching. Not to save them, but to see what they would become when everything they knew was stripped away. The wind carried the sound of drums, distant, rhythmic, and ancient. Tiana turned her head toward it, her eyes narrowing. They're not drums of war, she said quietly. They're calling the spirits of the fallen. He looked at her, uncertain whether to believe. But in her face, he saw no fear, only destiny. And in that moment, as thunder rumbled on the horizon and the storm gathered once more, he understood that the true battle ahead wasn't just against men with rifles. It was against a past that refused to die. The morning they reached the valley, the sky was the color of rust and smoke. A cold wind blew through the canyon, carrying with it the faint smell of burnt wood and iron. Tiana dismounted first, scanning the cliffs with the wary gaze of someone who had learned never to trust stillness. The farmer followed, his injured arm bound tightly, his face drawn from days without sleep. The silence between them wasn't emptiness. It was a shared understanding that something was coming, something they could neither run from nor hide from any longer. The valley looked almost peaceful from above. The stream ran clear, reflecting the sky, and the red cliffs stood tall around it like ancient guards. But both of them knew better. This was where it had all begun. The fire, the soldiers, the broken peace. The land remembered, just as Tiana had said it would. They found shelter beneath a rock overhang that overlooked the entrance to the canyon. From there, they could see far enough to spot any movement below. Tiana knelt, pressing her palm against the earth. They will come from the south, she said quietly. They always follow the same path. He nodded, adjusting his rifle. How many do you think? Too many, she said. But the land gives us what we need if we listen. She pointed toward the narrow pass at the southern ridge. There are rocks above that ledge. If they come through, we can block their path. He studied her as she spoke, steady, calm, focused. The same woman who had walked into his camp seeking shelter now stood like a leader preparing for war. She moved with purpose, gathering dry brush, setting small traps along the lower trail, laying out a plan that could only belong to someone who understood how to turn the land itself into an ally. As the sun sank lower, the world turned gold and blood red. The farmer caught himself staring at her again, wondering what had made her so strong, so sure. She caught his gaze but didn't speak. The silence said enough. Both of them knew that when night fell, there would be no more waiting. That evening, smoke rose from the horizon. At first it was faint, then thicker, carried by the wind. Tiana watched it carefully, then said, "They're close." The farmer loaded his rifle, his hands trembling just slightly. "How far do you think?" "Before the moon rises," she answered. He swallowed hard. "We won't have much time." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Time has already run out. What we do now decides what survives." They worked quickly. Tiana showed him where to take cover, how to use the terrain to their advantage. They gathered stones along the ridge, set up what little ammunition they had, and hid the horses deep in the cliffs. Every small sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, felt louder than thunder. As the light faded, the wind died too. The whole valley held its breath. Then from somewhere beyond the ridge came the faint rhythm of hooves, slow at first, deliberate, then many more following. The farmer's grip tightened on his rifle. Tiana crouched low, her eyes scanning the darkness. "They're not alone," she whispered. "I can hear wagons," he frowned. "Wagons?" She nodded. "They mean to take prisoners." The idea chilled him more than the cold air. He glanced at her. "They think they'll take you alive?" Her lips curved in a hard, bitter smile. "They can try." Moments later, a glimmer of lanterns appeared at the mouth of the canyon, dozens of them swaying in the dark like restless spirits. The soldiers advanced in formation, the faint clatter of gear echoing off the stone walls. At their head rode the scar-faced officer, his voice carrying sharp through the night. "Fan out," he shouted. "They're here somewhere. Check the cliffs. Tayana raised her hand, signaling for silence. The farmer held his breath as the men spread out below. The air was thick with dust and tension. The officer paused near the stream, glancing around. Then his voice called out again. You can't hide forever, girl. You and your white friend made your choice. The words hit like a hammer. The farmer's pulse thundered in his ears. Beside him, Tayana's expression hardened, but she stayed still. She whispered, Wait, let them come closer. The soldiers climbed into the narrow path, the one she had marked hours before. The sound of their boots scraping against rock echoed loud and sharp. Tayana waited, her fingers resting on the rope she had tied around the edge of a boulder above the pass. When the first line of soldiers reached the midpoint, she gave a single tug. The rope snapped, and the rocks came crashing down with a roar that shook the ground. The canyon exploded with chaos, shouting, gunfire, and the crash of stone. Dust filled the air, choking and blinding. Now! She cried. The farmer fired, his shots ringing out into the smoke. One soldier fell, then another. The return fire came fast, bullets slamming into the rocks around them. Sparks flew where lead met stone. Tayana fired her revolver, each shot measured, deliberate. Below, the soldiers regrouped, using the wagons for cover. The officer's voice cut through the gunfire. Don't waste your bullets! Surround them. The farmer reloaded, his hands slick with sweat. They're trying to flank us, he shouted. Tayana nodded, already moving. Follow me. There's another ridge above. They climbed through the smoke and dust, hearts pounding, lungs burning. Bullets whined past them, hitting stone. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the dry scent of the earth. When they reached the upper ridge, they could see the whole valley below. Lanterns scattered like fallen stars, men shouting, horses rearing in panic. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. Then the officer stepped into view again, his scar catching the firelight. You think you can hide in my land? He shouted up at them. You think that savage will save you? The farmer raised his rifle, but Tayana placed a hand on the barrel. Not yet, she whispered. He wants you angry. Don't give him that, the officer laughed, spreading his arms. You can't change what you are, boy. You'll hang for helping her, and she'll be dragged back to the fort, same as the rest of her kind. The farmer's breath caught. The words cut deep, not because of their cruelty, but because of the truth they reflected. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He looked at Tayana and she looked back, calm and steady, as if she'd already accepted the price. They'll come again when the moon's high, she said quietly. We'll use the dark to move to the North Trail. He nodded, but inside a storm raged. Every instinct told him to protect her, yet he knew she didn't need saving. She was fighting for more than herself. She was fighting for something he'd never had to think about, freedom that couldn't be granted or bought. When the shooting eased, they retreated deeper into the cliffs. The moon rose pale and distant, casting the world in silver light. The valley below was littered with smoke and broken wagons. The soldiers regrouped around small fires, their silhouettes restless against the glow. They'll climb at dawn, Tayana said. They always wait for light. They believe we can't see them coming. He turned to her. Can we? She met his eyes. I see everything this land hides. They walk where my ancestors walked. It will not favor them. He wanted to believe that, but doubt gnawed at him. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. Still, he said nothing. He trusted her, more than he trusted himself. As the night stretched on, they spoke little. The wind carried faint sounds from below, boots scraping rock, horses snorting, men murmuring about ghosts in the canyon. The farmer closed his eyes for a moment, trying to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every sound felt like a warning. Tayana sat beside him, staring into the dark. They fear what they don't understand, she said softly. They see us as wild, but the wild only fights when cornered. He opened his eyes. And what about you? Are you cornered? She turned toward him, her face calm but fierce. No, I'm home. The sky began to pale with the first hint of dawn. The soldiers below started to move again, spreading along both ridges. Tayana and the farmer took their positions, each knowing this might be the last time they'd stand side by side. The wind picked up, carrying dust across the valley. When the officer raised his hand, the signal went out. The world erupted in sound, rifles cracking, rocks splintering, voices shouting through the smoke. Tayana fired first, striking one soldier down before disappearing behind the rocks. The farmer covered her flank, firing until his rifle clicked empty. He ducked as bullets tore into the stone beside him. A grenade exploded near the lower ridge, sending dirt and fire into the air. The blast knocked him back, ears ringing. When he looked up, He saw Tiana still standing, reloading, her face streaked with dust and determination. "Stay low," she shouted. He crawled toward her, pulling the rifle strap over his shoulder. "We can't hold much longer." She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the far ridge, where the scar-faced officer was climbing alone, his rifle raised. "He's coming for me," she said. The farmer's breath caught. "Then we end this together." The air between them seemed to tighten, heavy with everything left unsaid. They exchanged one last look, a promise, a farewell, and something deeper that words couldn't hold. Then she moved, quick as a shadow, down the ridge toward the approaching officer. The farmer followed, every muscle burning, every heartbeat louder than the gunfire. The cliffs shook with the sound of battle, the smoke rising like a storm. And as the sun broke over the horizon, turning the sky into fire, both knew the moment had come, the one they'd been running toward since the night she'd first stepped into his camp and said, "I assumed we were going to be alone, but in this valley, under the watchful eyes of the land that remembered everything, no one was ever truly alone." The air trembled with the sound of rifles and shouted orders. Smoke rolled through the canyon like low fog as the farmer reached the ridge where Tiana faced the scar-faced officer. The rising sun threw sharp light across the stone, catching on the barrel of the officer's rifle as he aimed it squarely at her. She stood tall and still, her hair whipped by the wind, her face streaked with dirt but calm as if she'd seen this moment long before it came. "End of the line," the officer called out, his voice raw. "You should have stayed where you belonged." Tiana didn't move. "I am where I belong," she said quietly. "You're the one who's lost." He laughed, bitter and tired. "You think these cliffs will save you? You think some farmer with a conscience changes what you are?" The farmer's breath came fast as he crouched behind the rocks, watching, waiting for a clear shot. He could see the man's finger tightening on the trigger, could hear the metallic click of the rifle's hammer. The world seemed to hold still for that heartbeat before everything broke loose again. The farmer fired first. The shot cracked through the still morning air, echoing down the valley. The officer stumbled back, his rifle spinning away as he fell to his knees. Tiana stepped forward, eyes wide, not in triumph but in sorrow. The man looked up at her, blood on his hand, disbelief clouding his face. "You fought for her," he said, voice hoarse. The farmer lowered his rifle slowly. "I fought for what's right," the officer coughed, eyes fading toward the sky. "Then you'll die for it too." And with his last breath he signaled his men below. The echo of his command spread like wildfire. More gunfire erupted from the base of the cliffs as the soldiers advanced again, furious and desperate. Tiana turned to the farmer. "They won't stop now," she said. "We must finish it." They ran higher along the ridge, bullets striking stone at their feet. Tiana moved swiftly, leading him toward a narrow crevice that wound behind the rocks. It opened onto a plateau above the valley, a place where the wind howled like an ancient spirit. From up there, they could see everything, the soldiers below, the smoke rising, the stream cutting through the land like a vein of light. "This place," Tiana said between breaths, "was once a sacred ground. My people said the earth here chooses who walks away." The farmer loaded his last rounds. "Then we let the land decide," he said. The soldiers reached the base of the plateau, firing blindly into the rocks. Tiana lifted her bow, arrows striking fast and true. The farmer fired beside her, each shot finding its mark. But there were too many. They could hear shouts closing in from behind, more troops climbing the far ridge. The world narrowed to dust, noise, and the sharp taste of fear. Then Tiana stopped shooting. She dropped to one knee, pressing her hand flat against the ground. The farmer turned to her, alarmed. "What are you doing?" She didn't answer at first. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in words he couldn't understand. Soft, rhythmic, carried by the wind. When she looked up again, there was something fierce and calm in her face. "My father said the land remembers its own," she whispered. A rumble rolled beneath them, faint at first, then louder. The edge of the plateau cracked. Rocks splintered and crashed down the slope, sending dust into the air. The soldiers below shouted in confusion as boulders tumbled toward them, blocking the path and scattering their ranks. The earth itself had turned against them. The farmer stared, half in awe, half in fear. "You did that?" She shook her head. "No, it was always waiting." The gunfire slowed as the soldiers scrambled for cover. Smoke thickened, and the echoes faded into silence. The wind returned, whispering through the grass as if nothing had happened. When it was finally quiet, the farmer sank down beside her, his strength spent. Tiana leaned against a stone, breathing hard. "It's over," he said softly. She looked out over the valley. "No," she said. "It's only sleeping." He followed her gaze. The scattered men below, the broken wagons, the empty trail leading back toward the fort. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. And in the west, survival was all anyone could hope for. They stayed on the ridge until nightfall. Neither spoke much. The moon rose silver and steady, lighting the path of the stream below. Tayana finally said, "They'll come again someday. Maybe not for me, but for others. The land will have to protect them too." He nodded. "And you?" "I'll go north," she said. "To the hidden valleys where my people still sing. They'll need to know what happened here. They'll need to remember." He looked at her, unsure how to ask what weighed on his heart. "And what about me?" She smiled faintly. "You have a good heart. But your world and mine walk on different trails." The words stung, but they were true. He had known it from the beginning. She belonged to the wind and the wild earth. He belonged to a life that no longer fit him. "Still," he said quietly, "I'll remember too." Before dawn, they packed what little they had. At the stream, Tayana filled her water pouch and turned toward the north. The farmer stood a few steps behind her, watching as she tied a small feather to a piece of leather and handed it to him. "Keep this," she said. "It's from my mother's cloak. When you hold it, you'll know the land still hears you." He took it carefully, nodding. "Thank you." She looked at him one last time, her dark eyes reflecting the pale morning light. "When we met, I said I thought we would be alone," she said. "But the land had other plans." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it never meant for anyone to be alone." Then she was gone, walking north along the river, her figure growing smaller with each step until the rising sun swallowed her in gold. The farmer stayed behind for a while, repairing what he could of the camp. He buried the officer near the stream, marking the grave with a simple cross made of driftwood. For all his cruelty, the man had once believed he was serving something bigger than himself, and that belief had destroyed him. The farmer said no prayers, only stood for a moment in silence, then walked away. Weeks passed before he reached another settlement. People whispered when they saw him, dusty, wounded, carrying an Apache token tied around his wrist. Some said he'd gone mad out there in the canyons, that he'd fought ghosts or lost his faith. He didn't correct them. He only asked for supplies and said he was heading west. At night, by his campfire, he sometimes thought he heard her voice in the wind. Sometimes it was just the rustle of grass, sometimes the cry of a hawk, but always it reminded him of that valley, the place where the land had chosen who would walk away. Seasons changed. The war between settlers and tribes faded from headlines, replaced by newer troubles, newer greed. But the stories of the Apache girl who stood against the soldiers and the white farmer who fought beside her lingered in campfire tales. Some said she still lived among the high ridges, watching over travelers who dared to cross that land. Years later, when the farmer was old, he returned once more to the valley. The cliffs were the same, the stream still clear, the air still carrying that same quiet strength. He walked to the place where she had stood that morning, and from his coat he took out the old feather she had given him. The colors had faded, but it still caught the light when the wind touched it. He tied it to a low branch above the stream and smiled. "You were right," he whispered. "The land remembers." The wind rose gently, brushing through the grass, carrying his words away. The sky above the red cliffs turned gold again, just as it had the day she left. He closed his eyes and listened, not to the silence, but to the living hum of the land around him. Somewhere in that sound was her voice, her footsteps, her promise that nothing sacred ever truly disappears. And when he opened his eyes again, the valley looked just as it had the first time he saw it, wild, beautiful, and eternal, a place where two strangers had met by chance, fought against the world, and proved that even in the harshest land, the human heart could still find its way home.